Pop Shield, a long-form discussion podcast about musical topics both past and present. I'm Gabe, and I'm joined as always by Dan.
Hello.
And Darren.
Hello.
Before we dive in, I've got a little field trip to report on. I went and saw Chai at the Empty Bottle in Chicago. This was on January 25th, so about 2 weeks ago now. Have either of you guys listened to Chai?
No, I haven't.
I did just a little bit, but not a whole lot.
Well, they are, they really were my favorite thing when I first checked them out, but then I happened to catch a stream of theirs at the Pitchfork Fest last year, and they just looked like so much fun that when I happened to be in Chicago, I thought I should go. And, I basically, this venue was really awesome. It's really like nice divey place with actually like really cool lighting and stuff behind the artists and everything, good sound, but I was a little miffed because they, the ticket said something like doors open at 7, show at 8, but the first, performer didn't actually start till 9:30. Then the next performer at 10:30, and then Chai at 11:30. So, you get a little grouchy, like just being at a super crowded bar with nowhere to sit or whatever for that long.
Well, everyone under 30 just switched off the podcast.
Yeah, well, no, I asked some people, like, there were people strolling in at like 11, and I was like, is this normal? And they were like, yeah, never show up on time to an Empty Bottle show. So I was like, oh, well, fuck, okay. But I only mentioned that because by the time, like, the opening notes of Chai, all my grumpiness just faded away because they seriously are so much fun. It's like they have this kind of cutesy Japanese girl group thing, complete with like choreographed moves and everything. And yet it's like cranked up to 11 to where it's almost a send up of that. It's like such a hyper sugar rush that it's, a little tongue in cheek maybe. And it's got this almost like shoegazy element, but still very like fun, shiny, funky pop. And it's just the craziest show. I mean, like they do these like little choreographed things, like, switch costumes and dance around and stuff. And like at points end up rocking really hard while still doing these like cutesy little, choreographed like pigtail bounces back and forth, and stuff. And it's just like the craziest thing. So I just strongly recommend that you guys see it. I don't know if I sold Dan, but Darren, you're you can be a bit of a weeaboo, just to be honest. Does this sound appealing to you?
I mean, cute Japanese choreographed dances, I'm in. Like, let's sign me right up. And honestly, like I checked them out before because I think Pitchfork was like, reviewing, I think their latest album, and I just based on a quick browse, I thought, okay, this is kind of interesting, but I don't know, I didn't really catch anything in my initial listening, but it definitely sounds like the live experience is something worth seeing.
Yeah, absolutely. But all right, let's jump into today's topic. We've been wanting to do some sort of jazz themed discussion for a while now, and we finally decided, why not just jump straight into the deep end with a full episode on free jazz? Though there were plenty to choose from, we settled on perhaps the two most famous free jazz albums, Ornette Coleman's Free Jazz, A Collective Improvisation from 1961, which gave a name to this most challenging of genres, and John Coltrane's Ascension from 1966, which brought it to the masses. We want to do a deep dive and a compare and contrast with these classic LPs, but we're also going to use them to interrogate the genre as a whole and figure out how the hell one gets into free jazz to begin with. Now, I want to circle back to some of these bigger questions, but let's start by talking about our feelings about free jazz in general, our personal histories with these albums in particular. What about it, Dan?
Yeah, I'm a huge free jazz fan. Some of the late period John Coltrane, some of my favorite music ever. So I'm a big Sun Ra fan. I've only been to one jazz concert in my life, and it was Peter Brötzmann. So I'm pretty in on it.
So I consider myself a fan of jazz. Free jazz, I'm a little less as enthusiastic about, I guess I would say. And both of these albums I kind of came to fairly new, even though I consider myself a fairly big John Coltrane fan, for instance, but just not having a lot of experience with Ascension.
Yeah, for me, we talked about this a little bit on our Captain Beefheart episode, but I felt this compulsion, years and years ago, just that I didn't understand free jazz, but I had to figure out how to get it. You know what I mean? And so it was like these records, I spent a lot of time listening to them just over and over and just trying to understand it. In fact, I did this, there was a period in my life when I jazz in general, I couldn't understand and just forced myself to get into it. I rented a jazz textbook from the library and it came with a couple CDs. So it would have example songs of different periods and artists and stuff. And I just worked through the whole thing until it started to make sense. And I would just spend so much time listening to each period of jazz. And the free jazz was definitely the hardest, but just like with Captain Beefheart, it was at a certain point, it just stopped sounding bizarre to me or difficult to me, even like Brotzman, it's just, and now it's such a, I've internalized it so much that I really do listen to this kind of music influenced by free jazz, probably primarily. That's the thing that I really listen to. So let's start with the biggest question of all. What is free jazz? How would you define it?
I mean, it's a difficult thing to define, I think, but basically it's free improvisation. There may be a skeleton of a song that's written, but the ultimate goal or whatever during the playing is to just play what you feel. It's not concerned with specific chord changes or modal things. Like previous jazz genres and all. It's just free. I mean, it's a great descriptive genre title, really.
Go ahead and pass it over here, Dan.
Yeah, I think there's a little bit of a it when you hear it kind of a thing, but,
sort of,
but how would you define it, Darren?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, when you think about jazz music and you think about, in comparison to free jazz, you think about boundaries, right? You think of okay, well, jazz has got pretty clear rhythm, drum beat, we're following some sort of a time signature. There's even there's almost you can almost simplify it down to a verse, chorus, verse. You just kind of know where you're at all times. And then when you get to free jazz, you kind of break down all of those boundaries where you're just no longer held back by any sense of a consistent melody or here we are with this passage and this is the only, we're not going outside of this. Here with free jazz, you're kind of allowed, like Dan sort of said, to just kind of freely improvise and go in whatever direction you seem to want. And then, at different points throughout this seemingly long piece of improvisation, you kind of circle back and you kind of bring things together in a brief passage, but then you just kind of unleash again. And, to me, I just feel this sense of all the boundaries that you would normally have understood with jazz music is kind of just broken down and you're sort of freely exploring. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it is actually really interesting because I think jazz as a genre, prior to free jazz, it's really fascinating because it's often about setting up parameters and then exploring within those parameters. It's jazz, often they'll play these standards, sometimes they're jazz standards, but sometimes they're, pop tunes, My Favorite Things, famously by John Coltrane, where that the key sets up the parameters, and then within that you dig around and explore. It's always been about improvisation and creativity, although it's not only about that. There is composed jazz and stuff, but once we get here, you then do away with, it's the same idea, except for you do away with those parameters, the holiest of parameters, which are key and tempo and the rules that nobody thought that you could actually break. So on that note, I kind of want to talk a little bit about where free jazz comes from. I guess my opening question is, do you guys see it as kind of just, exploding out of nowhere? Or do you feel like jazz kind of slowly evolves into this, or what?
I think jazz slowly evolves. I mean, when you think of very early, Dixieland, sort of New Orleans jazz, it's very different from, just modal jazz and bebop, hard bop, all that stuff. Everything sort of very slowly becomes more and more towards the avant-garde until we get to free jazz and fusion, which sort of change the rules completely, both in their own ways. But free jazz just sort of completely does away with them, and fusion adds rock and whatnot. But yeah, I think it sort of slowly gets here.
Yeah, what do you think, Darren? Do you see it as like a revolution or just kind of a logical next step?
It almost feels like a logical next step. And I mean, I'm not a jazz historian, and you guys obviously probably have more experience than I do in this genre, but the idea of like soloing in jazz music seems like it's kind of something that's just always sort of been there, like you were mentioning, Gabe, like you might start within these parameters, but then you start exploring, and generally it's like one instrument at a time. Like, okay, now the saxophone's going to have its solo piece while everyone else is kind of like keeping the rest of the song together. Maybe we'll have a drum solo, maybe, you know what I mean? And so the progression there is then like, all right, well, let's have the saxophone solo, and maybe the bass and the piano can kind of do their own thing at the same time. And now, before you know it, everybody's like kind of soloing around like the same time. And I feel like it's revolutionary, but at the same time, when you listen to it over and over again, I mean, you know what you're listening to. You know that it is jazz music. It's recognizable. There are pieces here that you've kind of heard before. It's just the way it's now put together is a little bit different. But it doesn't feel as if, okay, now I'm no longer listening to jazz. I'm listening to something totally different. You know what I mean?
I think that's a great point. It doesn't seem like completely alien. It's not like you're listening to a whole nother thing you've never heard before. It's just a like different form of something you have heard. Like you said, you instantly like recognize this as jazz. It's got the same sort of palette that jazz has kind of always had. It's just presented in a different way.
Right, like my kids can recognize it. They're like, jazz music, okay, but then they're like, well, what's going on? Yeah. Because it just sounds like they're just like playing at random, and so the part they're missing is those kind of parameters that they're expecting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, on one hand, it's interesting because it feels like jazz as a genre is defined by sort of restlessness and exploration. So if you just follow it along, there's always these like next steps, and it gets to the point like in the 50s where this like hard bop is, it's starting to like the notes are like fluttering so fast, and they are like cutting through the chords in the strangest ways. I think like early Coltrane is just like this is my favorite thing about it, is that he just like rips off these notes, and they just kind of like, they just go in the weirdest ways. Like he's still in the chord parameter, but it's unexpected still. And then it feels like eventually when you get to free jazz, it's kind of like you just remove like two more things, which are, key and sort of tempo and stuff like that. At the same time, free jazz kind of casts itself as like revolutionary. We'll talk about like Ornette Coleman's Shape of Jazz to Come. It's like, this is the new thing. It very much presents itself in that way. And so there is some historical context that I think is really fascinating as well, which almost does make it feel like an explosion. Free jazz is closely tied with like the civil rights movement of this period, this late 50s, early 60s. And it kind of like captures the turbulence of that time, where like tensions just get cranked up to 11. It's also kind of connected to, and this is part of like this civil rights movement, is this like primitivism or this like returning to roots. Like, there's a lot of literature, Black literature from the 60s that's sort of, authors like changing their names back to traditional African names or wearing traditional African clothing and stuff like that. And so the free jazz world is often tied with this kind of like, you know what I mean? Like get back at this like primitive, like pre-Western music rules kind of a thing, where it's maybe closer to like just hollering freely, like in a drum circle, and it gets that kind of vibe going on, and on the same path it gets like a very spiritual vibe sometimes, which we'll talk more about. Simultaneously though, you get this like influx of what was going on in contemporary classical music at the time, like the Fluxus movement or like John Cage and stuff like that. It just feels like, and I think about like the nuclear age, like how scary and freaky that was, and how it doesn't seem like the world makes sense anymore once you know that it can like end in a second. And so, you know what I mean? Doesn't it feel like this cocktail just explodes all of a sudden at the same time as well?
Yeah, I mean, this period of time, just in general in America, is like, such a shift in like culture, technology. It's like really like the dawn of a new age, sort of thing. And free jazz, I think like really, showcases that. I mean, like you said, Ornette Coleman, I think is like definitely like aware of what he's doing. Like you said, Shape of Jazz to Come is before. I mean, even his first record's called Something Else.
Right.
Tomorrow is the Question is the next. He's always like sort of like up into free jazz. He's pushing forward. He's telling you, this is the next step. This is the next wave. Whatever.
Yeah. Do you find all that stuff interesting? Do you find that influences how you listen to it, Darren? Like thinking about it, the historical moment and how kind of radical it was?
Yeah, for sure. Because kind of like what you were just mentioning, I mean, you point to any part of culture during that time, there was some level of a revolution or a distinct like shift from the past happening in all different genres of music, art, I mean, film, I mean, everything was kind of like exploding in one way or another. So it's, when I listen to this record, I feel like it just belongs in that era. You know what I mean? Like it's right alongside anything that we've talked about from past episodes regarding the 60s and music at the time. You know what I mean? Like it doesn't, it seems to be this is jazz's response, or jazz's take on the kind of like cultural explosion that's kind of happening from the late 50s into the 60s.
Yeah, and I do think though that it is very distinct from like the classical the contemporary music of that period, because it is like about improvisation. It's like a band, in a room, like listening to each other and feeding off each other and everything. And yet let me sort of walk through a brief like disclaimer history before we get into Ornette Coleman. You can't say that like Ornette Coleman started free jazz necessarily. There are, basically artists, people mention like Lenny Tristano. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right a lot, but these are kind of like jazz musicians working in jazz who I think are inspired by the kind of like atonal, type things going on in classical music in the first part of the 20th century. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. You even get people like Cecil Taylor as early as like 1955. I think his first album comes out, which is not like free jazz, but the things he's playing on piano are really starting to like push against the walls of what is allowed, quote unquote. But it does feel like we reach a new step with Ornette Coleman. We mentioned Shape of Jazz to Come, which I think, he's signed to like Atlantic, and I think it's just like a much bigger audience. I know that they had this like really famous residency at the 5 Spot in New York, and like people, I love like the story of everybody just had to come and hear it, and like some people fucking hated it, like Miles Davis fucking hated it, and like other people couldn't like believe what they were hearing. There's like a famous story of Charlie Hayden, the bass player, it was just playing, and he just like has his eyes closed and he opens them, and Leonard Bernstein is just leaning his ear up against his bass to hear exactly what he's doing, which is like, you just imagine like the cultural moment here. But that kind of leads us to, Coltrane, not the next album, but the album after that, he releases Free Jazz, a collective improvisation, which was the first like full length improvised album. And I think it really does kind of kick things off. You can tell by the name, which he basically coins, and, it takes on a life of its own. I want to mention the personnel on this album because it's always important when you listen to jazz. You basically have 2 quartets, one in each channel, left and right. On the left, Ornette Coleman on alto sax, Don Cherry on pocket trumpet, Scott LaFaro on bass, Billy Higgins on drums. On the right, Eric Dolphy on bass clarinet, Freddie Hubbard on trumpet, Charlie Hayden on bass, and Ed Blackwell on drums. It's basically like the classic Shape of Jazz to Come quartet, plus a few other trailblazers, an additional quartet. Beyond that basic information, how would you guys describe the sound, the structure of Free Jazz, a collective improvisation?
Well, Darren, why don't you take it, since you're the newbie, if you will. I'm interested. Also, I don't want to do it.
So yeah, how do I start this 37-minute take? So the first I have to mention this because it kind of was on my mind when I first started listening to this. Like, I really got this sort of vibe of like like in movies, and I think of like maybe like Fantasia, where like there's like this sort of vortex scene where a character's like being flown through something, and like there's sounds of music maybe just like passing by, like left and right as they're sort of soaring through whatever it is. That was like sort of my initial like, whoa, especially the way this starts, where everyone's just kind of like, it kind of explodes into everyone's playing at once and everything, and it's a little overwhelming. But obviously with repeated listens and kind of like paying closer attention to certain different passages and sections, you can sort of like start to pick things apart a bit. So I actually I hadn't really read into it just yet as my first couple listens, so I didn't really understand that there were like two quartets actually happening separately. After understanding that, that sort of changed again how I was listening to it, and kind of picking up, okay, so there's somebody soloing here while everyone else is kind of playing. There's times where everyone kind of comes together. There's even a moment where it's like da 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 da, and I'm like, oh, yeah, here I got it. This is it, and then it falls apart again, and we're back into like improvisation. So I don't know if I'm even like helping at all with like describing the sound, but there's just so much kind of going on. Help me out here, Gabe.
I mean, I guess the first thing to say is that there is a definite structure to this piece, which is that there are these, you mentioned them, these like fanfares that are composed like very brief little sections. They almost have like, you were kind of singing it just a second ago, but it almost sounds like, news at 9, like,
it does,
you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And they're pretty strange. And this is the kind of like strange composition style that you would hear on Ornette Coleman's earlier albums, but this is like, I think, really the first full-blown free jazz album. So those are like the briefest little snippets that just kind of like structure us. And after every like ensemble fanfare, which is sometimes like quite chaotic for a second, but then kind of like comes into these like elongated passages, we get a solo, right? And everybody takes a solo one by one, and yet there is an awful lot of chatter like going on. A lot of times in the middle of somebody's solo, like everybody just starts coming in, like all the horns just start coming in and everything. What would you add to that kind of like large view description, Dan?
Yeah, I mean, to think about it like sort of abstractly, like what it sounds like to me, it feels like sort of like you're at a party or like a banquet or something, and like oftentimes like everyone's just chattering amongst themselves, and you're sort of like in the middle of it, and then sometimes somebody is the main one. So, maybe somebody's doing a speech on stage, or they've sort of taken the floor. But, you're getting like a little whisper here, people talking back and forth. There's one section, like right before the one of the bass solos where like two of the horns are sort of like chit chatting back. Somebody plays a and, they respond, it's sort of like, literally sounds like chatter to me, like this whole record. It just sort of feels like being in the middle of a party, and it's that sort of like feeling when you're in like a big room, like a concert before like anyone actually starts playing, like you can hear that like everyone is talking, but you can't really like hear any conversations. You might get a word here and there, a sentence here and there or something, but you don't have a sense of what everyone in the room is saying, and that's sort of like what this feels like to me. Like you sometimes get a little piece like what Darren was humming, like, oh yeah, something you can grasp onto, and that's the sentence you get, but then it immediately disappears. I don't know. That's
there
sort
are
of the way I feel
like
about
points.
it.
I think that's a good analogy, and this album in particular feels extremely conversational, where they are talking back and forth. Sometimes it's as if somebody says something with their horn or whatever, and then somebody like just has to jump in and add a point, which sometimes like inspires a bunch of other people to come in all at once on top of each other, sometimes not. There are points like there's a part I really love in the middle of Don Cherry's solo where it's like the two, I think it's Dolphy and Hubbard. That's another kind of nice part about this album, is that there are fewer horns, so you actually like can remember who is there's only like two on each side, know. So Dolphy and Hubbard are like, they start playing these like stretched out like harmonies, and it's almost like it's almost like two people, like one's like da 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 da, the other's like da 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 da, and then they're both like da da, like together, and it just is its own conversation, completely removed almost from like what Don Cherry is doing on the other channel. I also think it's important to mention that, well, first off, Darren, what do you think about that analogy? Do you think that's helpful? Like the idea of a conversation being in the middle of a party or something like that?
Yeah, certainly. It sounds as if, there's a call from one side and then somebody's responding. Like, I totally get that. I totally love the idea of like, yes, like you're in a party. I was kind of thinking even more so like with actual music being played at these parties, where you can kind of sometimes hear things, sometimes you don't, you know what I mean? Like it's kind of in and out. That's definitely, I like that. Like I hadn't really thought of it that way, but yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. And at the same time, it does have, I think that people will be surprised if they haven't listened to this, to find that it makes a lot of sense, actually. You basically have, you've got the bass on the right side, which I believe is Charlie Hayden, and he's playing like a pretty consistent rhythm the entire time.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's like doom, 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 doom. It's like walking, even though it goes, in sort of a chromatic way, like all over the place. And on the left hand, you have Scott LaFaro's bass, which is more like a lot of high notes, like much quicker, like almost like double time.
Right.
And yet at the same time, the drums on the right, which are Ed Blackwell, they're also kind of laying a pretty consistent pulse. Maybe it's not entirely like in sync tempo wise with the bass, but it's a pretty straight driving kind of thing. And then you'll notice on the left, Billy Higgins' drums, he's kind of like on the same tempo, but in like double time a lot of the time. And they're both like kind of throwing in occasional toms and snares and stuff. But do you guys kind of agree with me that there's like a pretty consistent drive to this?
Definitely. I think the one thing that like sort of makes it feel like all the rules are not actually being broken is the drums. And it's just because like, they are sort of keeping like, it doesn't sound like if you let a toddler sit at a drum set and they're just going, fucking mental. It's right. It's clearly two people who can play the drums and can play them very well, and they're playing, quote unquote correctly. There's the occasional, like you said, tom hit, snare hit, roll or cymbal or something that sort of feels like maybe out of place or something, but like it's not really, like it's still. And I hate to use like the word, but correct,
Yeah. I mean, as a mostly first time-ish listener, Darren, do you find it like just pure cacophony, or do you find it like pretty actually, structured in that way?
So at first I kind of did. At first I felt like this really was like a mess and that there wasn't any sense of structure whatsoever. But, upon further listening, I kind of felt like, oh my, this is actually... Maybe this makes more sense than even Ascension does, which, I mean, we'll get into like the differences there. But, and as far as the drums go, I mean, you would think like having two drummers playing at the same time, that at times you would think they would kind of be playing on over top of each other, or like the beat would suddenly, just become crippled because somebody's doing too much or too fast or whatever. But
yeah,
I'm kind of like shocked at how much this almost sounds like it's like a single drummer kind of keeping things together in a lot of ways. You know what I mean? Like somebody maybe just kind of focusing on like hi-hats and like cymbals while the other one's sort of like...
Yeah, that's a good point.
Snare.
They stay out of each other's way. Yeah. And I find the same happens with the bass. Like two bassists could be kind of crazy, but because like LaFaro mostly stays very high, and you get more of like the traditional like booming walking sound from the other side, it's like, you know what I mean? It actually works together in a way that's not cluttered,
Yeah, exactly. I mean, with the drums, I think if you just listened to this and you didn't know anything about, there's two quartets, the channels and everything, I think you would probably guess there's just one drummer, it like really feels like that most of the time.
Yeah. So I think, I want to sort of circle back to the horns a little bit, but before we, while we're still in the bigger picture, what do you think that Ornette Coleman is after with this piece? Like, are there any discernible themes to this thing? Because it's pretty abstract music, but I do think of it like, I often think about the cover art, right? Which includes like a Jackson Pollock painting, right? And so it almost feels like that's almost like the key to unlocking what he's after here, which is like something like a Pollock painting, like this just explosion of like, color and shape and everything. And in that respect, we actually talked about this a little bit when we did our episode on like Grateful Dead versus Velvet Underground. This feels like a little bit, maybe not like nihilist, but a little bit more about like, something closer to like the chaos in the universe or the meaninglessness in the universe or something, that a lot of artists were responding to at that time, especially like I mentioned in the nuclear age, just like, we'll talk about Coltrane and how he's a little bit more on the spiritual side or like the transcendence side. But do you guys, am I just adding this because of the cover, or do you like actually listen to the music and think about that type of worldview at all?
I mean, maybe it's because it's on the cover, but I had almost the same thing written in my notes here. Like this is sort of the audio version of abstract expressionism.
Right.
It sort of sounds like what a Pollock painting looks like, and yeah, I think that's. I mean, he wouldn't have put it on the cover.
Right.
I feel, it's not like he's just like, oh yeah, I like that paint, throw it on there. I feel like it's definitely a measured choice, to use something like that, especially like it's not it's a paint. It wasn't painted for the record, it's a pre-existing piece. So I think there's definitely got to be some sort of choice in that, and I think it sort of is the key to this record.
Yeah. I mean, like, Darren, you were kind of mentioning this, but, I think a lot about, like, when I'm listening to this, I think about the way that, like, atoms and stuff just, bounce around and crash into each other all the time. Like that picture of the universe, post-Big Bang universe. Do you think about that at all while you're listening to this?
Yeah, for sure. And, like, going back to the Jackson Pollock thing, I mean, it just wouldn't surprise me if it was as simple as, like, Coleman kind of holding this up and saying, let's try to create this in the form of music. Like, let's try to recreate something like this. I never, and we talk about this with other genres of music where we talk about how things might sound amateurish or like improvised to the point where like, okay, this doesn't seem like it was really rehearsed or thought about. It was just kind of like, it just kind of happened, or versus times where we're like, oh no, this seems very calculated, deliberate, even though it sounds improvised. Here, I'm like, I just get this sense that like I'm listening to 8 geniuses talk to one another through their instruments. You know what I mean? Like having a conversation about the universe or some large, bigger picture type of subject through music. And because there's not a moment where I'm like, I'm not like, ew, this sounds awful, this is hurting my ears. It's never that. It's like these guys, these who are masters of every one of their instruments, kind of like expressing themselves, and I'm just there to trying to sort of understand what these people are talking about. You know what I mean? It's like, imagine like having philosophers on a stage just kind of like talking to each other, and like you're just kind of trying to follow along and understand.
Yeah, it's almost like they're so so much above you. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. No, I think that I think that's like a strange thing about like free jazz and stuff, because like you said, like a lot of like experimental music and like, quote unquote weird things like the Shags, sort of like the coolness of it is the like untaught, outsider sort of thing, and like free jazz is really sort of the opposite of that. It's the Picasso thing. Like it's people who are great musicians and they know all the rules, and so that they're allowed to break them. It's like kind of the like polar opposite of outsider things that somehow gets a similar result.
Yeah, you do really get that feeling, and it's funny because when we did our episode on Trout Mask Replica, we talked about how it feels like do they know how to play their instruments or not? And then you learn that they did, and that it was all a decision, and that's pretty impressive. But here, I never feel like am asking myself, like, do these guys know how to play?
Yeah.
On that note, let's talk about some highlights, specifically the solos, right? One thing that I think, we'll get to this, but one thing that's very obviously different between this and Ascension is that the solos are very long, like always like 5-6 minutes. Sometimes, Coleman's is like almost 10 minutes long. And, I mentioned also that there are interjections quite often, but are there any like solos or moments that stood out to you particularly?
I mean, I really love like one of the like weird things that you can grasp onto, and I'm pretty sure it's Coleman doing it, but I could be wrong. It's like he keeps playing this like themes like da na 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 na, like it keeps like coming back, and it just like it gets stuck in your mind, and you're like, it's like catchy, and it's like fucking what should be catchy about this, right? It's like such a strange like feeling to get something from this like kind of stuck in my head, and it makes me like really enjoy that about this.
Yeah, I think for me, I love when there's like a solo or such a focus on every single instrument. The bass clarinet, I don't think I ever really appreciated until kind of listening to this over and over again. I'm a huge fan of like very late in the piece where you have just a bass soloing.
Yeah.
Then there's a drum solo.
It's crazy because you get two bass solos like on paper, but neither bass stops playing ever.
Right.
Right. So they're both like pretty much duets, even though you kind of feel that one is taking the lead. And there are some like crazy passages there, especially like they both start like strumming at points, like it almost like it takes on a like Godspeed You Black Emperor vibe where like both are strumming and like sort of climbing up and down the fretboard. There are parts where they start like hitting that kind of like, they must be hitting like the above the, I don't know, it's called the top of the, where the strings tie on, because it's like grink, 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 and they're like doing it back and forth and stuff. There's just like, you just kind of find yourself being like, God fucking damn it, like how many sounds can a bass make? And I do love the, again, we get two drum solos as well. I particularly love the Higgins solo, which is like literally a cymbal solo.
Yeah,
it's the last solo here. And like, the other drummer is kind of like, he's kind of given us like a pretty steady beat on like the, sort of hi-hat and snare. And meanwhile, the other guy is like soloing on the cymbals, and it's like almost reaches like drone ambient vibes where it's just like, it's like crazy shit. But so how did it go listening to this, attempting to get into this over these past 2 weeks?
So I struggled. Being able to set aside a solid 37 minutes uninterrupted can be difficult, obviously, and with the most, your average album is like 37 or 40 minutes or whatever, but it's like 10 tracks, 11 tracks, like you kind of know where you're at. It can be difficult if you get interrupted and then trying to come back. And then, I kind of found myself just like always like having it on and like almost challenging myself to make sure I knew, where I was at, or trying to figure out where I was at. And getting towards the end and kind of understanding like, okay, now I'm towards the end of the piece, because like on Spotify, it has like the first take after that. So if you're not careful, you just kind of end up in it again without realizing. But I got the hang of it. Like I understood like when you get to the section where the bass solos are happening and you have the drum solos, like I knew where I was at, and that just kind of gave it so much more structure to me. Like it kind of helped me understand it. And then there are those passages, again, like those fanfares, like you mentioned, Gabe, that happen that almost like help bring you back and like remind you like where we're at and, where this is going, and suddenly giving all this free jazz like some sort of structure, which was really fascinating. And I just found myself enjoying it more and more, and like not at all feeling as if I was just not getting anywhere with it. I even was like playing it with my kids in the car and stuff, and they didn't really understand it. I mean, my youngest son was like, "Yeah, this is cool," but he, what does he know about
plebs
jazz music? But I mean, overall, it got better with time, and I never really felt discouraged or felt like I was just like, I'm never getting this. And like I mentioned before, I'm a fan of jazz music, so I think people who enjoy jazz music, I don't think that free jazz, or at least what we've heard so far, I don't think it's impenetrable. You know what I mean?
Yeah, there is actually some, that's the thing, is like sometimes you listen to something experimental and you're kind of wondering, like, is there something to figure out, or is this like just random, or what is this? And I genuinely, I think we talked about like something like Radiohead's Kid A, right? Like it's experimental in a sense, but it's the kind of thing where you first hear it and you're kind of like, but it repays you if you're willing to do the work. And I think this album in particular, you do start to sense a structure and like a movement. I think that we didn't really talk about this, but it interestingly like kind of mellows out as it goes along. Where you've got these like, it's a little bit more like cacophonous early on, and then to kind of make room for the bass solos and everything, you got to kind of quiet down and stuff, and then the drum solos kind of take it on their own, of course. And it just adds, it's peppered with those like fanfares, but it has like a nice movement, you know what I mean, Dan? How it like actually is going somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost sort of like backwards from a normal song. It's kind of
right.
And the next album does this more, I think, but it sort of like starts with the crescendo and like builds whatever the opposite of a crescendo is, Yeah,
decrescends. Okay, so let me do a quick kind of like run through again of what went on in between Ornette Coleman's album and our next album, John Coltrane's Ascension. I think that it's important to remember that, like, looking back, we think of Ornette Coleman as like this revolutionary, changed everything. And I think that is like ultimately true. But I do believe that he was like a pretty underground artist, and that free jazz was a pretty underground phenomenon, up to this point. And you get a couple classics. I don't know exactly, but I have a sense that they were pretty like avant-garde, pretty out there pieces. Dolphy actually released an album called Out There, but it's, you get a couple, sort of free jazz or free jazz adjacent masterpieces in these couple years after Coleman kind of kicked the doors open. So you get stuff like Albert Eiler's Spiritual Unity, and Albert Eiler is like another absolute juggernaut of free jazz. You get Dolphy's, I mentioned Out There, but Out to Lunch is like probably his most famous, I think, from 1964. Cecil Taylor by this point has gone like full blown free jazz, just smashing his piano to fucking bits. And then things change when we get to John Coltrane's Ascension in 1966, because I think Coltrane was an absolute juggernaut, like superstar of jazz, and all of a sudden he jumps on board. Like, doesn't that feel like kind of, that must have really, brought it to the masses? You know what I mean?
Oh, I mean, for sure. I was watching some like YouTube videos of like, this sort of era Coltrane like live, and he's playing at like universities, he's playing big rooms, and you can tell the people in the audience are sort of like, maybe they liked Blue Train or something, but they're getting
right.
Even in some
My
of the
favorite
ones,
things.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. Like, I really love one of his live records, Live at the Village, Vanguard again, the one like with Pharoah Sanders, and he plays like My Favorite Things like during that, and just like fucking destroys it, like it starts and oh, it's my favorite thing. And I feel like if you were in that audience and you were just sort of a casual fan or something, you'd be like, oh, stoked finally. And then just like him and Pharoah, murder the song, and just the destruction that would go on in that room. It's nuts.
Yeah, I mean, can you think, Darren, of like I have trouble thinking of like a analogous situation, today or something. I mean, like, I guess in some ways, like Kanye doing Yeezus was pretty fucking crazy. You know what I mean? Like, to hear like a
but I don't even think that that's
like going so abrasive.
I don't think that's even as big of a jump, though. Like
yeah. But you know what I mean, Darren? Can you think of anything?
Not really.
Like what this must have been like? I just can't even fathom.
And so this is like, so Coltrane, because you mentioned like Coleman was kind of like underground, you're saying, but like Coltrane would have been like a much bigger name.
Yeah, I mean, if you knew
Timeless.
Coleman, you were in the know. Whereas like Coltrane,
Right. Everybody
know.
knew Coltrane.
So is this like Coltrane's like sellout moment or something where he's like?
I think it's the opposite of that.
Yeah, the very opposite.
I guess
This is
so.
like
Yeah, I
literally-
guess it would be him admitting that the underground is cool, right?
Yeah. I mean, I just can't like even imagine what it would be like to hear somebody of John Coltrane's stature taking this turn. And it doesn't come out of nowhere, like I keep trying to mention. You mentioned Live at the Village Vanguard, but actually there's like a earlier Live at the Village Vanguard that he did, and there's a complete set, like the complete Village Vanguard 1961, I think, where it's him and Dolphy and his like Love Supreme band, I think, mostly. And it's basically like a residency. It's just like all 5 nights that they did this, and each night they're just like chasing something. He actually has like the centerpiece of each set is the song "Chasing the Train," and it's just him like just ripping, at the walls of music. And it's like he finally arrives at Ascension with like the full-blown free jazz thing. Got to read the personnel again. You've got John Coltrane, of course, on tenor sax, Freddie Hubbard on trumpet. He was also on Coleman's album. Dewey Johnson on trumpet, Marion Brown on alto sax, John Chakai, hope I'm saying that right, on alto sax, Pharoah Sanders on tenor sax, Archie Shepp on tenor sax, McCoy Tyner on piano, Art Davis on bass, Jimmy Garrison on bass, and Elvin Jones on drums. It's basically like the classic Love Supreme quartet that everybody knows, plus a bunch of future free jazz stars. Like almost everybody here blew up except for Dewey Johnson, who was plagued with mental health issues and never recorded another album, and like went to a mental hospital eventually, which is quite haunting. But in describing the sound and structure of this album, I think it's important to note how different this is. You do have 2 bassists, but for the most part, you've got kind of like a quartet and then like a fucking sax fest on top of it. You know what I mean? And the other crazy thing is piano. We didn't mention this, but Coleman famously like did away with piano because he thought it adds like too many rules, that it sets the chords, the key that you have to play in, and without it, you're free to explore like microtonally, which he was pretty famous for with these like bendy microtones and stuff. There is piano here, which is pretty interesting, I think. But beyond that, how would you guys describe big picture sound and structure of this album?
Well, I think first you didn't mention that we're talking about edition 2 of this record.
Yes,
because there are 2. Edition 1 was originally released, and I don't really know the reason why, but it was switched with edition 2 a couple months later, and Coltrane preferred edition 2. That's why
it's just 2 takes.
Like he pulled a Kanye, basically, right?
Yeah, basically.
I'm a fix Ascension.
Yeah, but it's just like the 2 takes of this piece recorded the same day. It's just he decided to change the take to the first take, which is confusingly known as edition 2. But we should mention that. But okay, how would you describe this whole thing?
Well, let's let Darren do it again.
Yeah.
So this one, I felt like I got right into kind of right away. And, it's going to sound very like simple and dumb, but like the music starts off very differently than Coleman, right? Coleman kind of explodes, whereas like Coltrane has the very familiar like, you're like, oh,
yeah,
okay.
A motif
right,
from
I'm like,
A Love Supreme.
Yes. And Love Supreme, one of my favorite albums. Like, that's one of the few like jazz records I have on vinyl. You know what I mean? Like I'm already there. I'm like, all right in. And it kind of builds slowly into this free jazz, kind of like cacophony almost. But I feel like I'm eased into it in such a way that like I never truly feel entirely lost. And we mentioned the piano, and I'm going to mention it here in terms of the sound. Like, you can clearly hear the piano, and it's there, and it's a familiar sound. I think it is almost like a comfort. Like if you're feeling lost, like you can pick it out of the mess. All these,
definitely,
this big band of brass that's happening underneath it all. You can hear like the piano chords. And you're like, okay, I kind of understand where I'm at. The drums sound a lot wilder, I feel like, at times on here.
Yes.
And I think maybe
I wrote down like, is this John fucking Bonham playing his drums? Because
yeah, I mean,
they're like
they're smashing those cymbals.
I know, they sound
like
so good.
crazy.
I love it.
So like a world apart from the drumming on Coleman's free jazz. You know, like this is just wild.
Yeah, and I don't know if it's just the lineup here that really shifts things, but like I feel like it's hard to compare the two because I feel like there's so much different emotions or feelings that are kind of like coming out on this record.
Yeah, what would you add, Dan?
Yeah, I mean, with the feelings, like you said, I mean, there's definitely at this period, you know, from A Love Supreme basically on, like Coltrane's like developed this spiritual jazz thing, and I feel like you can feel that, you know, there's a like, I don't know, some sort of, I'm not a spiritual person, but there's some sort of like, you know, I even though I'm not, I can like sort of feel what he's getting at. But I think like Darren said, that the piano being there like really fucking helps. You know, it is just like a real anchor point. Anytime you're feeling lost, you're feeling like this is just too out there, you can focus on that, and it sort of brings you back in, which I think is great for, you know, especially like Coltrane, like we talked about, like being like such a big popular figure in the jazz world, you know, but essentially bringing this like crazy avant-garde music to, you know, the normal people, you know, quote unquote.
Yeah.
You know, I think doing something like that like really helps his case. And then these like these ensemble like little things in between the solos, I feel like they're sort of more, again, normal than the little fanfares that happen in free jazz. And like even during the solos on free jazz, you know, it's sort of like everybody's always talking, just sometimes like somebody's talking the loudest. I feel like here, like the solos are it's not that everyone stops, solos. You know, but yeah, they're much more like your normal kind of jazz solo where somebody like really takes center stage. The rest of the band, you know, kind of keeps the rhythm, you know, whatever, you know. I feel like that happens much more defined on this record.
Yeah, I think so too. And actually, I was surprised though to hear you say that it's like maybe a little more accessible, because I found it like very like more inaccessible, honestly, because it does kind of ease you in with these like sensuous, you know, spiritual sounding passages from A Love Supreme, but then it gets like quite cacophonous, and you know, it's got this, you know, I think of like, just in contrast to this, I think that Ornette Coleman's album is like quite controlled, you know, even though people do chatter over each other and stuff. We talked about how there's like a very consistent pulse the whole time. On this one, it's like the bass is not playing any kind of consistent pulse, or neither bass is. It's just kind of doing its own thing. The drums are like just madness almost the entire time. You know, they're not fanfares, but they are like just, it almost sounds like a big band kind of feeling, and every horn is just kind of like exploding, it sounds like. And so what I should mention is that it's structured essentially the same way as Coleman's album, where you have like ensemble, solo, on and on and on. But what's interesting is that the ensemble passages are much longer here. The solos are usually like 2 to 3 minutes compared to like up to 10 minutes on Coleman's album. And the ensembles are often quite similar in length, like 2 to 3 minutes usually. Don't you guys find like the ensemble passages quite cacophonous? Like there's almost nothing to anchor onto?
I feel like they really feel like crescendos. You know, like I said about free jazz earlier, it's sort of like this backwards, you know, crescendo coming inwards, you know, imploding. I feel like this one's just always sort of, those ensembles are crescendoing. But also, maybe you're right. I mean, one thing I sort of struggled with, like this album for a long time, I think was my favorite Coltrane record. So I've heard it like a lot, and I think like a little bit of the weirdness or strangeness, whatever, is like gotten where it's difficult to remember that exists here for me. So you might be right.
Oh, that's interesting. what do you think, Darren? Did you find it like much like more abrasive and cacophonous than Coleman's album? Did you find it, you know, you mentioned having the piano as an anchor. Did you find it like an easier listening experience or a harder one?
At first, I definitely felt like it was an easier listening experience. Again, and I talk about the ease of getting into it versus the way Coleman sort of explodes and kind of, you know, put me in a place where it felt like I was struggling to grasp it, right? But as I indicated, upon further listening, I did start to grasp it and piece it together and understand it. To this one, as continued listenings go, and then kind of going back and forth between the two records, it was definitely very noticeable, the glaring differences, largely surrounding the ensemble parts, where you just have horns blaring at times, basically as loud as they can. And
it sometimes sounds like, you know, like the craziest passages of Revolution 9 or something.
Yeah,
and like whipping by your head.
When you get the drums sort of like smashing like they do, it just feels as if like suddenly the drummer doesn't really know what anybody else is doing. They're just kind of like matching that. They're trying to, you know, match that abrasive, blaring horn sound. You know what I mean? But I think where things shine is where you get into the solos, you know, particularly like obviously Coltrane's solo. I think, you know, Pharoah Sanders' solo, the way they are sort of like pushing the sound of their instruments in such a interesting way. I feel like I kind of always like came back to, and it just felt, you know, overall familiar. And I talk about the piano being just almost like a consistent like layer that I kept latching onto, and even when those ensemble pieces would kind of swell up, I think that yes, it gets very cacophonous, but it happens in such like a slow, like it kind of like builds and builds and builds, like a crescendo, and then it kind of lets you down and you ease into, and like
very
solo.
Gracefully like eases into the solo. It's actually extremely impressive. I just like to imagine like the kind of looks they're giving each other or whatever to like all get on the same page. It's like,
I'd love to see
amazing.
Like a video of it being, you know, recorded. I know. I was thinking a lot about that. One thing with this record, I feel like there's, especially in these ensemble pieces, there's like always this like sort of tension, like building. It almost always feels like the record's ending, you know, like especially like when you've been listening for 20-25 minutes or something, you're like, okay, you know, this is it, this is the end right here, and then it's like, oh no, there's like 6 more solos gonna happen, you know, and I don't know, that's like a great feeling I like, you know, in this, you're just. I don't know. It's almost like it's like a record of like anxiety and tension and stuff. You know, it's like a feeling that's not all, you know, as explored in music as many other feelings, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think like you guys actually mentioned a bunch of stuff that I think is like really key here, which is that, you know, this is a lot less conversational than Coleman's album. It doesn't really feel like they're talking to each other at all. You mentioned this, Dan, but it feels like they basically completely get out of each other's way for the solos. And what's interesting about this is that the solos are so distinct from each other. Like they are extremely unique personalities. I think you can tell that even on first listen. Whereas on Coleman's album, like it feels more like they're all on the same page. They're like of a piece, you know what I mean? Even though like obviously Dolphy is different than Coleman, it's like almost like they discuss like some sort of mood or like style that they were after. Here it's like, all right, we all like, you know, just blow the shit up with these ensemble pieces. Then it's your turn. And in talking about like what is Coltrane after here, you know, you talked about that spirituality. And when I listen to this album, I think about like, you know, like chasing something, and that it's like basically everybody's solo is their chance to like take it as far as they can. And then we get like this cacophony, this reset, and then it's like, all right, now it's your turn. Like chase it, like try to transcend. You know what I mean? And then it's like everybody kind of takes their turn doing that. And I think that results like in just a much more unique solos. Do you kind of agree with that?
Oh, 100%. I mean, some of the solos on the, I mean, I love free jazz, you know, the previous record, but this record I think is just on like another level. I mean, the Coltrane solo, like Darren mentioned, is obviously great, but Sanders is like amazing. Like I
Yes.
I just that like honk noise he does is
Yes.
it's the coolest fucking noise ever, you know? Like it's just like
It sounds
so
like
cool.
I mean, it sounds like malfunctioning like electronic equipment.
No, I know.
basically. Like
It does
I've been
not
to noise
sound
shows,
like
you know, where it's like somebody's just playing like a mixer that's broken, and
Yeah,
it's like like he is totally on that page, and it really is like
it's like so
You know what I mean?
ahead
Like
of its time.
you have a much better chance on this album, like of just it's on and you're like, oh, that's Hubbard, you know, oh, that's Archie Shepp, you know what I mean?
Oh, 100%. You know, I feel like, you know, I followed along, you know, like Wikipedia has, you know, a list of like the times of everybody playing. But I mean, the people in here, their voices are so much more like defined. And I mean, I'm a big Coltrane fan, I'm a big Sanders fan, but like, there's no mistaking when you hear that honk, like, oh, that's you know, Pharoah Sanders coming in, you know, Hubbard, Shepp, you know, everybody. It's like, I think this is a much easier one to be able to pick out and say, you know, this is who, you know, if you want to impress your friends while you're listening or something.
Yeah. Do you find the voices as distinct, Darren?
Absolutely. And, you know, I think the same way that we talked about Coleman's, the album cover, including like Jackson Pollock, I think the title of this record, Ascension, is kind of the theme that, especially the ensembles, where you get the sense of like this, you know, rising, this ascending to a new level, and then kind of easing you down to where that now you hear a solo attempt to ascend, you know what I mean? And the sound that we mentioned with like Sanders and the solo from Coltrane, it just, if anything, to me, it's like, you know, define Ascension with your instrument and try to make that happen. You know what I mean? And I feel like that, at the very least, that was kind of always on my mind as I was listening to this, that Coltrane is kind of after this, like, very spiritual, like, kind of other, you know, rising to the higher plane, I guess.
Higher plane, yeah.
And I feel like it's, you know, I feel like it works here. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So, you know, you guys mentioned Pharoah Sanders, which I think is an obvious highlight. You know, are there other solos that really jump out at you? I mean, I really, I think it's almost like weird. Like Freddie Hubbard, his like trumpet sound is so like bright and beaming. He almost sounds like out of place. You know what I mean? He sounds like a more classic jazz, like it's smoother or something. And yet like it just adds to the like distinct group of personalities we have here. A lot of people like John Chakai's sax solo, which I want to highlight because I think it's really interesting that we're kind of like riding a very similar level, at least the rhythm section, up until that point. And it's like suddenly, I don't know if McCoy Tyner gets bored or something, but like he just drops out completely for that solo. And so there's like a bunch of new empty space. And the way that Chakai plays is like very ghostly or like haunting. It almost reminds me of Albert Ayler a little bit. Then on Archie Shepp's solo, he's just kind of like hitting these notes like like, you know, sustaining on the same thing, and it adds like so much atmosphere all of a sudden rather than like the chords he's been hitting. You know, so any other solos that you guys really like, but do you find it like interesting how the, you know, rhythm, do you find the rhythm speaking to the solos in unique ways as well?
Yeah, I think so. You know, in regards to the solos, like the Hubbard one, like you talked about, it's a little strange that like he is the person that's on both of these records. Because I read through a bunch of anytime, you know, listen to something like experimental or whatever, I like to read through the like rate your music reviews, because a lot of times they're really funny. And you know, one thing I noticed like a bunch is like people like sort of complaining that like Hubbard on free jazz is sort of the, you know, most normal of people.
Yeah.
And then like he sort of feels that way on this too, and it's like, you know, like it's almost, and
he's the only one who didn't like really dabble in free jazz.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like really strange that he is a part of both of these worlds. I mean, maybe both Coltrane and Coleman like wanted a little bit of the rules still, you know, and maybe that's their like reason for going to Hubbard or whatever. But I think like, yeah, Hubbard's solo here and on free jazz is like interesting for that reason. Like, I don't know. I just like I really would love to know like why he is the one that's on both of them. I would love to ask Coltrane or Coleman, that question.
Yeah, were there any solos that stuck out to you, Darren?
Yeah, I mean, I think you guys mentioned, obviously we talked about Sanders, and I think there's something to love almost about every one of the solos.
Yeah,
I'm thinking kind of like of the Shep solo in particular. The rhythm section kind of like rises, and he rises right along with it, and they just get louder and louder together, and like it's similar to the way the ensemble piece goes. However, it's just a solo, you know what I mean? I like that like they give that much room to the soloist. It almost kind of feels like one of those like rap songs where you have a bunch of like guests on it, and they all kind of like get
like a
their
posse
own
cut.
they get like their own like entire verse without really any interruption or changes and stuff. And I think I kind of, in some ways I miss it, like, because the way we talked about Coleman and how, like, yes, even during a solo, like, some of the other instruments would just kind of hop in at various times, almost reminding you that, hey, this is like an ensemble piece and everything. But I sort of like the way that it kind of ebbs and flows here, where you have that clear ensemble piece where everybody's involved, and it kind of dies away, and then you get into another solo, and it's like another take on the idea of Ascension, and the next one's always a little bit different than the last one, and you're kind of eager. I feel like every time I listen to it, I'm like sort of eager to like listen to it and hear the different sounds and try to understand, all right, whose section this is, and what's different about their section than previous ones. You know what I mean? Like, it makes it a little more fun as a listener to sort of make it clear, like, okay, here's this person's solo. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, and I think that's also really key in drawing the distinction between these two albums. Is like I mentioned that Coleman's album feels a bit controlled, but it feels controlled in the sense of like a Jackson Pollock painting is controlled. Like he throws paint and everything at the at the canvas, but it's designed.
The canvas exists. Yeah.
Yeah,
but
he's still using a canvas, right?
Yeah, he chooses where to throw it, and he chooses what colors need to go where and stuff. So it's got like the hand of the creator is there, even though it seems kind of crazy. And so I think that Coleman works on the same level. This, I think, is very different in that it feels like very deliberately trying to capture lightning in a bottle or something. It feels like just hit the tape and let's go. Yeah. And you hear them kind of like figuring it out as they go along. Sure. I think that there are some interesting moments here where it's like, famously, Chikai, his solo gets cut off early. Like you can tell that the ensemble comes in too early because he like takes these long pauses in between lines, and he just like takes a pause, and then they all come in as he starts to play the next line, and then he's like, oh shit. And his solo is like extremely short, which is unfortunate, but it's just kind of like a funny quirk here. I also hear that like as McCoy Tyner is soloing, which I also love, by the way, because of like how fast he like ripples these like super long high note lines. You can tell that like the drums are like, all right, we got to like take it down for the bass duet that's coming up here. And you can just hear him kind of being like, you know what I mean? Like doing a big drum roll, like, here we go. Oh, he's still going. Okay. Boop, 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 boop. And then he's like, all right, let's take it down. Nope, still going. Okay. Like, and it makes for like a more imperfect thing, but a more like alive thing. Like this is not a painting. This is like a living, breathing, you know what I mean? Like recording of a bunch of dudes in a room tearing shit up.
Yeah, I mean, it almost like feels like a live performance or something like, and I mean,
right.
It essentially is. It's just live right. in studio, kind of thing. But yeah, you're right. I mean, I like that there are those little, mistakes or whatever. But again, like you said, like comparing this to like Pollock and everything, when you see a Pollock in person, you can see footprints where he walked on it, little cigarette burns and stuff. And like those are sort of the same thing as, what you're talking about, somebody kind of accidentally stepping on their solo or ending too early or coming in too early or something, I really like that as like a piece of art, it's not perfect, and I don't think it like should be. I mean, for it to be free, it shouldn't. Yeah, you're not going to get perfection.
And this is about ascension, like specifically. This one is about like ascending. So it's like it's got to be messy. It's got to be wild. Did you kind of get that vibe as well, Darren? I want to sort of transition into talking about like how it went getting into this album, which one you like better between Ascension and Free Jazz. Do you like that quality, that messy quality here?
I mean, I think I do, and it's actually very difficult for me to kind of choose one over the other, because I came to kind of like them for different reasons and like different things about them so much that, like what you were saying, like this kind of like almost organic, like growing, living, breathing thing that was happening on record.
Right.
I mean, I'm a fan of that sort of thing. Like, I love, like, in a live performance when a band or a group sort of, like, changes up the formula and kind of explores a bit more, experiments a bit more, you know what I mean? And, like, something kind of comes out of that.
I hate when, like, those imperfections are polished out, Like,
yeah.
Like, I like when things feed back a little bit for a second, or, like, you hit the wrong note for a second. Like when it's just so polished and perfect. I just cannot stand it. Like, leave that shit in because it sounds alive.
And like what we were talking about with Coleman's record, I mean, again, we're dealing with like, geniuses like of their instruments, you know what I mean? So like for them to sort of like the ability to play as an entire group and kind of like probably just talk with each other with their eyes or their movements and like kind of like read each other and try to understand what the person is thinking just by the way they're playing. Like, it's fascinating being on the other side of that as a listener, just trying to like see where this is going. You know what I mean? And again, the whole comment I made about like never feeling like this is like amateurish or like they're just kind of like, effing around or whatever. Like, to me, they are still like feeling and like reading each other in some ways, even though it's like improvised, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, and less conversational, but it does still feel like they're feeding off of each other's energy, inspired by each other in real time. For me, getting into this album, I almost feel like I prefer Coleman's Free Jazz, and I think, like you, Dan, I mean, it's only because I've listened to it less, and so it still sounds like very novel to me. I'm actually like impressed by how controlled and yet free it sounds at the same time. For me, like the big challenge here, like I mentioned, is those ensemble passages. But one thing that I want to propose is I think it's kind of fun where when you listen through the album, you get to know everybody's like voice and personality. And after that moment, it's not like easy, but because they stay in the same place in the mix, you can hear them in the ensemble passages. You know what I mean? So you can be like, oh, that was Pharoah Sanders for sure, like doing that crazy blast that I just heard in the ensemble. And it makes it like almost like by the end, everybody. Like, because the last ensemble is like 5 minutes long, and it does sort of transition back into the Love Supreme motif. But, you get to know them, and then you can kind of pick them out from the crowd. Did you find this? Do you find this more challenging? I guess, which one do you like better, Dan?
I mean, I love Ascension. Like I said, for a long time, that was probably my favorite Coltrane record. Not anymore. I've moved on to other ones that I listen to more. But I mean, this is just like such a fantastic record. I mean, I love Coltrane. I love Sanders. Like, so like they're two of my like favorite musicians. I think, and so this record is just like unbeatable. But it was like, Ornette Coleman, Free Jazz. Like, it's a record I've heard many, many times, but it's not one I frequently return to. I like some of his other records quite a bit more, but so that one was like more fun, because it still had like a bit of novelness to it. But I think this record is just this is one of the greatest jazz records of all time, one of the greatest records of all time. So I think Ascension just can't be beat, really.
Okay, well, we've gone a little over. We've done a lot more gushing than I thought we would, but I do want to talk about free jazz in general a little bit here. And I guess it's fine if we go a little bit over. I mean, we're trying to ascend right here. We're trying to capture the living.
Yeah, we got no rules.
Pass it over.
No rules, yeah.
But now that we've sort of done this exercise, and sounds like, obviously some of us had listened more in the past, but it sounds like a smashing success. I think we all consider ourselves like we succeeded in getting into these albums at least. So for the people that are like me, when I was younger and just like, God, how the fuck do you get into free jazz? what is the best way to get into free jazz? What is the best way to approach it, to listen to it, and make it click?
Well, I got into it because I took a history of jazz class in college, so sort of like what you did, but just
right.
I got credits for it at least.
Expensive version.
So yeah, do the expensive thing. Yeah, I mean, it's honestly like sort of a difficult thing. I think maybe the easiest way is sort of like what you said, and basically what I did is like go through the history. Start kind of at the beginning. I really don't enjoy Dixieland or New Orleans, style jazz, but you get it. You get through it. You get into Miles. You move your way through the bebops, the hard bops, the modal, all that stuff. And I think just sort of like we talked about at the beginning, like the free jazz doesn't like just explode from nowhere. It's kind of the slow progression. So if you yourself make that slow progression, I think it's much easier. If you've never heard a jazz record in your life and you put on free jazz, like free jazz the record, not the genre, I think it would kind of mess you up, and you'd probably be like, you've got you can't even find those anchor points because you don't even have those anchor points yet. So I think you really do just sort of have to like work your way in it. Like just jazz is just sort of one of those genres that you got to sort of know the history of it, and it's kind of half the fun, like we talked about. Jazz has this like super cool thing. Like when you're listening to when you listen to a Coltrane record, you're actually like hearing frequently some of the other most famous jazz people. It's not
right.
It's not like when you listen to the Beatles, you're hearing the same four guys every time. Whereas jazz isn't like that, so it's so much fun to say, "Oh man, I really like the drums on this one. Who is that?" Oh, it's Elvin Jones. He's also on this record.
I think this is key. Yeah, this is really the best practical advice I can give is like, well, for one, if you're listening to these albums, do go on Wikipedia and like follow along. Definitely. They have timestamps of like who's soloing when, and basically, you could click on any one of them, and then you could go to like Rate Your Music and look up like what is their highest rated album or whatever. And you could do that and be like, which one do I like the most? Let's check it out. We talked about Pharoah Sanders. Solo is like really awesome, so maybe you could go there, right? And he's got a couple classics. But you'll find that every single one of these guys has numerous
at least
classics.
A classic, yeah.
And then when you listen to those, do the same thing. It'll be like, wow, this guy played on this. I got to check it out. Oh, and then you find like crazy shit, just when you first discover like, damn, there's like an album with Eric Dolphy and John Coltrane together. Got to hear that. You know what I mean? And it's like,
exactly.
You start to piece it together. How about you, Darren? Did you find like a good system for getting into free jazz? I mean, maybe even like one of these analogies, like I hear people, we talked about like being at a party or being in a conversation, or even people talk about like, thinking about it like being in church, where sometimes people like stand up and speak in tongues for a second, and other people are like, hallelujah, on the sidelines and stuff like that. Like, what is the best way to approach free jazz?
Yeah, I mean, I think, this might sound strange, but like trying to give it some sort of structure, I think is important. And the way you mentioned going to Wikipedia, like, and seeing how it's outlined gives it enough structure, I think, that makes it so much easier to kind of understand, right? If you just go into it completely cold, completely blind, it's gonna sound like a mess, just all over the place mess, and you'll have a hard time kind of understanding what the hell is happening. But taking a look at the Wikipedia, kind of understanding, all right, okay, I get it. So there's an ensemble, now there's a solo, and then as you guys sort of mentioned, like, with jazz, which is just a fun thing to do, is like digging into all the players that are involved in it, and like how cool it is that like these guys who have their own careers, their own albums, will then like play with each other and just be like a quote unquote sideman to somebody else. It's fascinating, and you could spend countless hours digging into totally different albums. But as far as like free jazz as itself, like trying in your mind trying to give it some structure, and then I feel like doing that kind of structured it in a way that like it makes it easier to listen to. So like this is not one of these records here in particular are not the kind of records where it feels like you have to listen to it like 40 times before you can unlock its secret. You know what I mean? I don't think it's like so impenetrable to do that. You just might need some supplemental material to kind of help unlock those pieces. And something just as simple as knowing that between the minutes of 15 and like 17:30, Eric Dolphy is playing, like that helps immensely. Yeah. And it's not like you need that every single time you listen to it. Once you've done it a couple of times, you'll then kind of understand, oh yeah, this is Pharoah Sanders. Like I know this sound. I recognize it now.
Right.
And it changes the listening experience.
Yeah, and I guess we should acknowledge that nobody starts here. Odds are you listen to a Love Supreme already. So that means like half the people on Ascension. You know what I mean? Like, do you love?
And I think a Love
drums
Supreme's a great place to start, actually.
Yeah, it is. And if you love the drums there, you're gonna love the drums here. Like, you probably already know Dolphy by the time you get here. It's like, so you immediately have a few things to latch onto that give it that structure. So you're like, all right, at least I know I can look forward to that dude's solo. So you guys brought up several of these issues that I also want to talk about for a second. Is free jazz for everybody? Like, we talked about this on the Captain Beefheart episode where we were like, should you force yourself? Like, should you do the work to get into this? Or is it more of like well, maybe it's just not for you thing? Or is it like a masterpiece? You got to get into it. Is free jazz that way? Is it like just for intellectuals, quote unquote? Does it, I guess it's a separate question, but does it like require all this extensive background knowledge? You sort of said yes to that already, Dan, but does that mean like, it's not for everybody?
I mean, I think it's for anybody who wants to put the work in. It's not for everybody. If you just like listening to whatever's on the radio or whatever, then free jazz probably not gonna float your boat. But if you have an interest in it, I mean, especially I think if you already like noisy kinds of music, noise rock, just noise thing, even experimental. I mean, you mentioned, like, some of this sounds like Godspeed and all, and I'm sure like Godspeed is ripping these kind of things off. So I think like if you already love music, I mean, if you're listening to this podcast, you probably it's probably for you. It's going to take a little work, but I think
gotten this far on the podcast.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. I think some of the best records require work. Like Trout Mask Replica and stuff like that is a fantastic record, but you're not going to like it the first time you listen to it. You've got to figure it out. You've got to unlock it. And free jazz is a whole genre of Trout Mask Replica. I think it's definitely worth the work. It's not, you don't have to be an intellectual. It probably helps, but you don't have to be, like I think jazz just in general sort of gets this like, uppity, college professor, intellectual sort of rap. But I think that's actually sort of bullshit. Like anybody can get into it. You just got to do it. You got to put the work in. I mean, this isn't pop music. It's sort of not it doesn't use the same like palettes and everything that like you're used to from hearing from the radio. So you have to sort of like learn. It's like listening to music from a different country or something. You gotta familiar yourself with. Oh, they're using different keys or whatever. You gotta put the work in.
Yeah, and I do think that like it is sort of like useful to know a little bit about the history because it is so tied into it. And I want to kind of shout out, this gets a lot of shit for some reason, but like Ken Burns made this like 10-part documentary on the history of jazz. And it's like really flawed because he's clearly just obsessed with like Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington. And so like most of it is about them, but like it does sort of walk you through all these different things. And it's really helpful to be able to know like what rules these guys are breaking, I think. And also to know that like, there are just so many different forms of jazz. There's like fully composed jazz and there's fully like uncomposed jazz. And like knowing what's in between that spectrum, a lot of people like, for some reason, Charles Mingus's like Black Saint and the Sinner Lady is like a really popular jazz album, like exceeding jazz's normal popularity. You know what I mean? I guess because it's got like almost like a post-rockish feel, but that's like third stream jazz. That's like fully composed, like in a note for note kind of way by Charles Mingus jazz. And it's like, if you don't know that, like you don't know what's so fucking crazy about an album like these, you know what I mean? But what do you think, Darren? Is free jazz for everybody? Should everybody do the work?
I don't think it's for everybody. I certainly think there's the type of like jazz fan that's really just going to love the sort of structured, you know, like just loving that kind of, you know, and that's all they really want, right? I think it is kind of like you have to kind of want to see what else is out there. You kind of have to be curious about what is beyond the typical jazz structure to want to get into this, you know. And I don't think that means you need to be an intellectual at all, but like kind of like us, where, you know, we're just always very curious about music and the history of music, and, you know, boundary pushers, you know, those who like push the envelope and stuff like that, you know, you just kind of naturally fall into free jazz, because if you're following along at all, you will get led there, you know what I mean? So, and once you do get led there, I think it's absolutely worth the effort, understanding the history. I think it only adds to the experience, as I sort of mentioned before, like just having some understanding changes how you listen to it, makes it more accessible. So in that regard, if you're interested in music and going deeper, then yes, absolutely, it's worth it.
Well, let me hit you guys with a slightly philosophical question, I guess. Is free jazz really free? We talked a lot about the structure that's here. You know, it's like ensemble, solo, ensemble, solo. You know, some people sort of criticize free jazz because in a way they're like as many rules as anything else. You know what I mean? Like, if you have a straight beat, it's like not free jazz, doesn't count. You know what I mean? Like, so is free jazz really free? Are these albums really free? Or perhaps you need some structure to actually break the structure, you know?
Yeah, I mean, it's like one of those sort of, like you alluded to, philosophical questions I think you can't really answer. But, I mean, no, I don't think it's like completely 100% free. I think the only thing that is 100% completely free is like just straight noise, you know, like harsh noise wall or something, you know, like there's really sort of no rule there. Although at like many noise shows, people try to impose them. And the other thing is like we talked about, all the people on both of these records are like top tier musicians, you know, they know how to play the instruments. They know all the rules of music and music theory, stuff I don't understand.
Right.
And because of that, they like can get outside the bounds of it, but I think still in a like somewhat controlled way, you know, nothing ever sounds like, well, I was gonna say nothing ever really sounds wrong, but I guess that depends on the listener maybe, but you know, like I think there are, I don't think it's completely free, but being completely free is nearly impossible with music, because it just becomes cacophony when it is, you know?
Yeah, what do you think, Darren?
Yeah, I mean, I think this entire discussion has largely been around sort of defining the structure of these free jazz albums, and I think that we would be having a very different conversation if there truly was no structure at all, right? And I think we would have had naturally a more difficult time listening if it was 40 minutes of just absolutely no structure whatsoever, you know, no
right.
drum beat, you know, nothing was like even
no
at all in sync,
no mellow out. Yeah.
Right. Well, and you know, we fairly easily were able to break down Ascension to ensemble solo. Like, I mean, and when you understand it like that, you're able to listen to it like that, and you know, like, but that doesn't that, to me, like, it is still free jazz. I mean, what they're doing inside of these ensembles and inside of these solos is unlike any other normal quote unquote jazz record, right? So in that case, like, yeah, they are kind of breaking the boundaries, they are breaking the rules for sure, but could it have gone further? Could it have been even more chaotic to where there's truly no structure whatsoever? Could it be more free, so to say? Sure. But that's I don't think that should take anything away from either of these albums or what they accomplish.
Yeah, I think that, some people, I guess it's basically unfortunate that the genre is called free jazz at the end of the day. It's kind of similar to like IDM, intelligent dance music. Like, oh, is regular jazz not free? You know what I mean? And in fact, Ornette Coleman didn't like the name free jazz for a genre. He actually sort of insisted that he was a composer. But he might also have had a problem with this idea that like free jazz is free. I think if you just forget about like the meaning of that name, you can call it like avant-garde jazz if you want or whatever, even though that's also a loaded term. It's really just like a different type of, we started trying to define this, and it's honestly not any easier, but it's just kind of like a different approach to jazz, a different approach to music. And it's almost helpful if you just think of it as like, just dropping those two like big rules, key and tempo, it's just two little things that are taken away, and it does create like a very rich, like new experience of music. But it's maybe like some people I think of jazz as like free jazz is like very pretentious, or super intellectual, like we were saying, and all that stuff really kind of fades away if you just forget about what the genre is called. You know what I mean? Now, last question, I think, having listened to these albums, do they still sound radical today, or does it sound a little bit like a, museum piece or like a piece of history at this point? And if so, like, how is it possible that it still sounds radical 50, 60 years later?
I think it does still sound a bit radical. I think like somebody like Darren, being a somewhat new listener, and he still, had to like work his way into it, ultimately ending up liking it. But I think like that right there proves that it's still radical. Whereas, if Darren were listening to, the Stooges or the Monks or something, like he would immediately understand it and, it would be fine. Whereas like when that came out, that was very like crazy. But I think it's like sort of lost its edge. Here, I don't think free jazz has. We wouldn't be having this discussion of, is it for everybody? Is it for just intellectuals? Is it pretentious?
Right.
If it didn't have that edge to it, still 60, 50 years later, whatever.
Yeah. What do you think, Darren?
Yeah, I think I'm in agreement with Dan here. I think it still does sound radical, and I mean, sure, it's historical, to a degree, because everything we were kind of talking about, the era that it came out in, and kind of understanding the players and what they had been doing in their career that led them to this point. But as far as like the sound itself, I mean, I'm thinking that this is like radical. As I'm listening to it, I'm a fan of jazz, but I hadn't really explored free jazz so much. So as I'm listening to it, I'm like, man, these are the masters of the genre that I thought I knew quite a bit about, or knew enough about jazz, going off into a new area, exploring a whole new arena, and just taking like their instruments and doing things that I had not really even imagined doing. And what I thought would just be a total mess actually sounds listenable and something that I can understand and actually get into. I think is kind of part of the genius. You know what I mean? Does that make sense? Like to be able to prove that like it's actually not impenetrable. It's not just a bunch of noise. Proves that it's something special.
Yeah, and I kind of mentioned that about why I think I slightly prefer Coleman's free jazz, is that like it's really, really remarkable. And in fact, I think it's the thing that makes it still sound so radical or so creative all these years later, is that it is both like wild, rule breaking, and yet really like listenable and structured. There is melody there. There are like harmonies there. There is tension and release and like all these things that you know what I mean? Like just the way that it strikes that balance, all these classic free jazz records of like listenable and yet really challenging, I think is the greatest, accomplishment of this whole movement. The last thing I think I want to say, and like you guys mentioned, like probably everybody who's made it this far already likes free jazz, but just in case you don't yet, I would just argue that you probably already like it, because I think the influence of this genre is everywhere. If you like Sonic Youth, I think you mentioned this, Dan, you already like free jazz. Like, if you like Jimi Hendrix, when he's like just playing the Star Spangled Banner or any of his like live pieces like Machine Gun or whatever, it's like he's literally directly responding to like the work that people like John Coltrane are doing, like just incorporating aspects of noise into his guitar playing. Like I think a lot more people than they realize, actually really, really like this. Yeah, I think we did a pretty good job figuring out how to get into free jazz. Is there anything you guys want to add?
I don't think so. Well, what do you think? We'd love to read your thoughts on the air. Email us, popshieldpod@gmail.com. Next episode, what a surprise. We're not sure. If you like the show, help us out by subscribing. Leave us a 5-star review wherever you get your podcast. You can stay connected. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, all that junk is at popshieldpod. And we'll see you in 2 weeks.
See ya.
So long.